For almost all of human existence, hunger was not scheduled. It did not arrive at 8 in the morning, or at noon, or in the evening. It came when the land allowed it. For nearly 200,000 years, the human body survived without the promise of 3 meals a day, without kitchens, without clocks, without certainty. And yet that body carried us across deserts, through ice ages, into every continent on Earth. The strange thing is not that our ancestors lived without regular meals. The strange thing is that we now believe regular meals are natural. Somewhere between the open savanna and the modern dining table, something in our understanding quietly shifted. If the human body was shaped in a world without fixed eating times, what exactly changed when we began to eat 3 meals a day, and why did humans live 200,000 years without 3 meals a day? For most of the 200,000 years that anatomically modern humans have existed, the world did not move according to a clock. The first Homo sapiens emerged in Africa roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, and for the vast majority of that time, there were no fields of grain, no stored harvest, no fixed kitchens, and no daily meal schedule. Life unfolded in response to light, temperature, migration patterns, rainfall, and chance encounters. Food was not divided into breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It appeared when the land allowed it. To understand why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, we must begin with the environment that shaped the human body in the first place. Early human groups lived as hunter-gatherers. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa shows stone tools associated with animal bones bearing cut marks, along with plant remains indicating gathering. These findings suggest a mixed diet, but they also reveal something more important: variability. Large game was not available every day. Edible plants changed with seasons, water sources shifted. Climate fluctuated dramatically during the Pleistocene epoch, which included repeated ice ages. In such a setting, predictability was rare. A successful hunt might provide a substantial amount of meat, but that success depended on skill, cooperation, animal movement, and simple luck. Some days likely brought abundance. Other days brought far less. The rhythm of eating followed opportunity rather than a fixed hour. The human body that evolved in this setting adapted to uncertainty, not routine. The evidence for this is not speculative but grounded in basic human physiology. Humans store energy in the form of glycogen in the liver and muscles, and more extensively as fat tissue. These energy reserves allow the body to function for extended periods between meals. This capacity is not unique to humans, but in our species it became part of a broader survival strategy. In an environment where food could not be guaranteed at regular intervals, the ability to tolerate gaps between eating events was essential. Importantly, this does not mean early humans were constantly starving. Ethnographic studies of more recent hunter-gatherer groups show that many populations were skilled at securing food and often met their caloric needs. However, even in these groups, food acquisition varied by season and circumstance. There is no evidence that structured 3-meal days were the norm. Instead, eating likely occurred when food was obtained and prepared. The absence of clocks meant that time itself was experienced differently. Human activity followed daylight and temperature more than hours and minutes. In that world, hunger would have been a biological signal emerging in relation to energy expenditure and availability, not to a socially defined schedule. When we ask why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the simplest answer begins here. The ecological conditions that shaped our species did not support rigid daily meal patterns. The environment rewarded flexibility. Groups that could adjust to feast and scarcity, to abundance and delay, were more likely to endure long migrations and shifting climates. Over tens of thousands of years, this flexible relationship with food became embedded not in culture alone, but in the biological systems that regulate appetite and metabolism. Long before agriculture and long before industry, the human body was learning to live in a world where eating was an event, not an appointment. If we remain in that early world and look more closely at daily life, the absence of 3 meals a day becomes even easier to understand. For nearly all of the 200,000 years of Homo sapiens history, people lived in small, mobile bands. Archaeological and anthropological research suggests that these groups often moved across landscapes in search of water, plants, and animals. Mobility itself limited the possibility of fixed mealtimes. When a group is walking for hours across open land, following migrating herds or searching for seasonal fruits. Eating depends first on what is found, and only second on when it is found. The structure of the day was shaped by terrain and light, not by a schedule for food. In such conditions, a successful hunt could provide a large amount of meat at once. Large animals, when available, were often shared within the group, as indicated by cut mark patterns on bones found at prehistoric sites. This sharing behavior suggests cooperation, but it also implies irregular intake. A substantial portion of calories might be consumed after a successful hunt, followed by lighter eating or reliance on gathered foods in the days that followed. The pattern would not resemble 3 evenly spaced meals. Instead, it would resemble variation, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on recent success. Plant gathering also followed ecological rhythms. Many edible plants are seasonal. Tubers, fruits, nuts, and seeds appear at certain times of the year and disappear at others. In African savanna and woodland environments where early Homo sapiens evolved, rainfall patterns strongly influence plant growth. During dry periods, resources could become more scarce. During wet seasons, they might become more abundant. The human diet, therefore, moved with the land. When we ask why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the answer again points back to the ecological reality. Food did not present itself 3 times daily in equal portions. It appeared unevenly, and humans adapted to that unevenness. Ethnographic studies of more recent hunter-gatherer societies, while not identical to ancient populations, offer additional insight. In many such groups documented in the 20th century, eating patterns were flexible. People sometimes ate when food was available, sometimes went longer between meals, and often did not divide the day into fixed meal categories. Researchers have observed that structured breakfast, lunch, dinner systems are far more common in agricultural and industrial societies than in foraging ones. This does not mean that early humans ignored hunger or lacked routine entirely. It means that routine was anchored in survival tasks rather than clock-based eating. There is also the question of preparation. Without permanent settlements or stored grain, food preparation took time and effort. Meat required butchering and sometimes cooking over fire. Plants needed to be gathered, cleaned, and processed. These tasks were influenced by opportunity and energy levels. It would have been inefficient to organize 3 fixed meals if food acquisition itself was uncertain. Instead, energy intake likely followed acquisition events. This pattern aligns with what we know about early human expansion. Over tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens spread from Africa into Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas. Such migrations required endurance and flexibility. Groups that depended on rigid daily feeding schedules would have struggled in fluctuating climates and unfamiliar landscapes. Flexibility was not optional, it was necessary. The absence of 3 meals a day was not a deprivation in that context. It was simply the normal condition of life. When we reflect on that long span of human history, it becomes clear that structured daily meals are a relatively recent development. For nearly the entire evolutionary timeline of our species, eating was integrated into movement, cooperation, and ecological response. The human body and social systems grew within that framework. The question is no longer why our ancestors lacked 3 meals a day. The deeper question is how such a long history of flexibility shaped the biological expectations that still operate quietly within us. To complete this first step in understanding why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, we must look not only at movement and food acquisition, but at time itself. For most of human existence, time was measured in light and darkness, in heat and cold, in wet seasons and dry seasons. The mechanical clock, which later helped organize work and meals into fixed hours, did not shape human behavior for the vast majority of our evolutionary past. In the Pleistocene landscapes where Homo sapiens first emerged, daily life followed environmental cues. People rose with daylight, rested in darkness, and adjusted activity to temperature and safety. Hunger, in that setting, was one signal among many, not an appointment marked by numbers. The body's internal systems evolved within this environmental rhythm. Circadian biology, which governs cycles of alertness, hormone release, and metabolism, developed in relation to the sun's predictable rise and fall, not in relation to scheduled meal breaks. While modern research shows that eating patterns can influence circadian rhythms, The foundational structure of human biological timing predates structured meal systems by tens of thousands of years. When we consider that Homo sapiens existed for nearly 200,000 years before agriculture began roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the scale of this difference becomes clear. Structured daily meals belong to a very small fraction of our species' timeline. Archaeological records reinforce this perspective. Early human sites reveal temporary camps, hearths, and tool-making areas, but not permanent food storage facilities in the earliest phases of our history. The capacity to store large quantities of grain came much later with farming. Without reliable storage, daily intake could not be guaranteed in evenly spaced intervals. Food availability depended on what could be gathered, hunted, or scavenged in a given period. Even with the controlled use of fire, which dates back hundreds of thousands of years in earlier hominin species and later in Homo sapiens, cooking did not create abundance by itself. It made certain foods more digestible and safer, but it did not remove ecological limits. This is central to understanding the long arc of human dietary history. The absence of 3 meals a day was not the result of cultural neglect or biological hardship. It was a direct reflection of ecological reality. When we imagine early humans sitting down to breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we project a modern framework onto a world that operated by different rules. The human body was shaped in that older world. Energy intake occurred in relation to successful foraging, shared resources, and environmental opportunity. Over thousands of generations, metabolic systems adjusted to this pattern. The ability to function between eating events, to store surplus energy, and to remain active during uncertain periods became part of our inherited biology. This does not imply that irregular eating is inherently superior or that modern meal structures are harmful. It simply means that for nearly all of our species' history, structured 3-meal days did not exist. They were not necessary for survival, expansion, or adaptation. When agriculture eventually introduced more predictable food supplies, and later when industrial societies organized time into rigid hours, human eating patterns changed. But those changes sit on top of a much older foundation. The question that remains is not whether 3 meals a day are right or wrong. The question is how a body formed in a world without scheduled hunger continues to operate within a world defined by the clock. When we move from the broad environment to the daily practice of hunter-gatherer life, the absence of 3 meals a day becomes even more concrete. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived primarily by foraging, collecting plant foods, and hunting or scavenging animals. This mode of subsistence shaped not only diet but also social structure, movement patterns, and energy use. Archaeological evidence from sites in Africa, the Middle East, and later Eurasia shows stone tools associated with animal bones bearing cut marks, along with grinding stones and plant residues. These findings confirm that early humans consumed a mixed diet. Yet what stands out is not uniformity, but variation. Food sources shifted across regions and seasons, and so did eating patterns. In many documented hunter-gatherer societies studied during the 20th century, researchers observed that meals were not consistently divided into 3 equal daily events. Instead, eating often occurred when food was acquired and prepared. Some days included substantial shared meals after a successful hunt. Other days relied more heavily on gathered foods such as roots, nuts, berries, or seeds. Caloric intake could fluctuate from day to day. While these modern groups are not perfect replicas of ancient populations, they provide insight into how a foraging economy typically functions without agriculture or industrial food systems. The structure of food access was directly tied to labor and environment. Hunting required planning, cooperation, and physical effort. Success was uncertain. Gathering, though often more reliable, depended on ecological knowledge and seasonal timing. In such a system, the concept of 3 evenly spaced meals assumes a stability that did not exist. When we ask why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, we must recognize that the daily rhythm of foragers was not organized around eating times, but around tasks necessary for survival. Morning might begin with tracking animals or traveling to a known plant site. Midday might be spent processing what was found. Evening might involve sharing and cooking if sufficient food had been obtained. Eating fit into this broader cycle rather than structuring it. There is also evidence that food sharing played a central role in early human societies. Large game animals, when successfully hunted, were often distributed among group members. This practice reduced individual risk but also meant that food consumption could be concentrated around certain events. Anthropologists have noted that in some foraging groups, large meals could follow a hunt while lighter intake occurred at other times. This pattern reflects adaptation to episodic abundance rather than fixed daily rationing. Importantly, this variability did not prevent human survival or expansion. Over tens of thousands of years, hunter-gatherer groups spread across diverse climates from African savannas to European forests and Asian grasslands. Their flexible eating patterns supported mobility and resilience. The body systems that regulated hunger and energy expenditure developed within this context. Appetite signals responded to energy need and availability, not to socially defined meal categories. The idea of breakfast, lunch, and dinner as standard divisions of the day is largely absent from the archaeological record of early Homo sapiens. Those divisions emerge much later, alongside agriculture, settlement, and structured labor systems. For most of our species' timeline, eating was integrated into a dynamic relationship with landscape and cooperation. The absence of 3 meals a day was not a gap in culture. It was the natural outcome of living in a world where food came in patterns shaped by climate, movement, and shared effort. If we look more closely at the internal rhythm of hunter-gatherer groups, we begin to see that flexibility in eating was not accidental but woven into the structure of daily cooperation. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens depended on small groups, often numbering a few dozen individuals. Survival depended not only on finding food, but on sharing it. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa and Eurasia suggests that meat from large animals was processed in ways consistent with distribution rather than solitary consumption. Cut marks on bones, patterns of transport, and hearth remains indicate that food was often brought back to a central place and divided. In such a system, eating was shaped by group dynamics, not by individual meal schedules. A successful hunt could provide a large supply of calories at once. Because fresh meat does not preserve easily without advanced storage methods, much of it would have been consumed within a short period. This creates a pattern sometimes described by researchers as feast and less feast, though not necessarily extreme starvation in between. After a substantial intake, there might be days where plant foods and smaller catches filled the gap. The result was not 3 evenly spaced meals, but a fluctuating intake shaped by availability and sharing. When we return to the central question, why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the answer continues to align with this social and ecological structure. A fixed 3-meal system assumes predictability in food supply and in daily labor. Hunter-gatherer life did not provide that stability. Work and eating were intertwined. If the group traveled farther in search of game, eating might be delayed. If gathering yielded abundant plant foods, intake might be spread out across the day. The variability itself became normal. Ethnographic records from more recent foraging societies offer additional insight. Researchers studying groups in Africa, Australia, and parts of the Arctic observed that meal frequency could change depending on season and success. In some cases, people ate one substantial meal after food was prepared. In other cases, they consumed smaller amounts, intermittently. What is consistent across many of these observations is the absence of a universal 3-meal pattern tied to clock time. It is important to remain cautious here. We cannot assume that all ancient populations followed identical routines. Human societies have always been diverse. However, the broad pattern supported by archaeology and anthropology indicates that regular, evenly spaced daily meals are not a feature of deep evolutionary history. They are more characteristic of settled agricultural and later industrial societies. The social fabric of early human life reinforced flexibility. Sharing reduced the risk that any one individual would go without food for long periods. At the same time, it did not create strict schedules. The group responded collectively to what the environment provided. Children, adults, and elders participated in a system where food moved through cooperation, not through personal pantries. Over tens of thousands of years, this way of living shaped expectations at both biological and cultural levels. Hunger was a signal linked to energy need and availability, not to a socially mandated hour. The human body and mind adapted to uncertainty supported by community. In that world, The idea of 3 meals a day would have seemed unnecessary because the rhythm of eating followed the rhythm of the land and the group. There is one more layer to consider within the hunter-gatherer pattern, and it lies in the relationship between effort, uncertainty, and appetite itself. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in conditions where physical activity was closely tied to food acquisition. Energy expended in walking, tracking, digging, climbing, and carrying was part of daily life. In such an environment, hunger did not arise in isolation from movement. It followed exertion, delay, and sometimes long stretches of focused activity. When food was finally obtained, preparation and sharing required additional time. Eating was embedded in a chain of effort rather than placed into predetermined intervals. Archaeological findings from multiple Pleistocene sites show that early humans often transported portions of hunted animals back to a central area for processing. This suggests planning and coordination, but it also implies delay between acquisition and consumption. The group might spend hours hunting and then additional time butchering and cooking. The meal was an event connected to success, not to the turning of an hour. In this context, it becomes clearer why a fixed system of 3 meals a day did not emerge. The structure of daily life did not revolve around segmented eating times. It revolved around survival tasks. Even plant gathering, often more reliable than large-game hunting, required travel and knowledge of seasonal growth. Roots and tubers needed digging. Nuts required cracking or grinding. Seeds sometimes required processing. These activities influenced when food could realistically be eaten. The sequence was shaped by landscape and labor, rather than by habit alone. When we revisit the central question, why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, we see that appetite regulation evolved in this fluctuating context. Modern physiology shows that hunger hormones such as ghrelin rise and fall in response to both habitual patterns and actual energy need. In ancestral settings, without repeated exposure to rigid schedules, hunger signals would have aligned more closely with exertion and energy balance. The body was accustomed to responding to availability rather than to anticipating a meal at a fixed hour. This does not imply that early humans experienced constant deprivation. Ethnographic evidence suggests that many foraging groups were effective at meeting their nutritional needs across the year, but meeting needs did not require dividing the day into equal portions. Nutritional adequacy can be achieved across varied patterns of intake, and for most of human history it likely was. Over thousands of generations, this flexible pattern became part of the background conditions under which the human species expanded across continents. Groups that could adjust intake to circumstance were better equipped to navigate unpredictable climates, long migrations, and fluctuating resources. The absence of 3 meals a day was not a weakness. It was a reflection of adaptation to ecological reality. Only much later, with the development of agriculture and settled communities, would daily eating become more structured and tied to predictable labor cycles. For the vast stretch of evolutionary time before that transition, the human body functioned within a world where eating was responsive, social, and variable. The pattern of 3 daily meals belongs to a relatively recent chapter in human history, layered on top of a much older system shaped by movement, effort, and the land. To understand more deeply why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, we now turn from landscape and social structure to the design of the body itself. The human organism carries within it a record of the conditions under which it evolved. Long before agriculture, long before stored grain, the metabolic systems of Homo sapiens developed in an environment where food availability was variable. This variability left traces not in memory, but in physiology. One of the clearest examples lies in the way the body stores and releases energy. When food is consumed, carbohydrates are broken down into glucose, which circulates in the bloodstream. Excess glucose can be stored in the liver and muscles as glycogen, yet glycogen storage is limited. Beyond that capacity, surplus energy is converted into fat and stored in adipose tissue. These mechanisms are well documented in modern biology. What matters for our question is not their existence, but their function. Glycogen serves as a short-term reserve, able to supply energy for several hours. Fat tissue serves as a longer-term reserve, capable of sustaining the body for much longer periods when intake is reduced. The presence of these systems suggests adaptation to intervals between eating events. If the human species had evolved in a world where food was guaranteed 3 times daily in equal portions, the selective pressure to develop substantial energy reserves would have been different. Instead, the evolutionary record shows that humans, like many mammals, are equipped to tolerate gaps between meals. During periods without food intake, the body gradually shifts from relying on circulating glucose and glycogen toward increasing use of stored fat. This metabolic flexibility allows continued function during fasting periods that naturally occurred in ancestral environments. Importantly, this shift is not extreme or pathological under normal conditions. It is part of standard human physiology. The liver maintains blood glucose within a narrow range through processes such as glycogen breakdown and gluconeogenesis, ensuring that the brain and other tissues receive adequate energy even when meals are not frequent. When we consider that Homo sapiens has existed for nearly 200,000 years, and that agriculture began only around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the timeline becomes significant. For roughly 95% of our species' history, regular daily meal structures were absent. The metabolic systems that regulate hunger, storage, and energy use were shaped during that much longer period. Hunger itself is mediated by complex hormonal signals, including ghrelin, which stimulates appetite, and leptin, which reflects longer-term energy stores. These systems respond to patterns of intake and expenditure, but they do not require 3 fixed meals to function. They operate within a broader framework of energy balance over time. In ancestral conditions, this meant responding to availability rather than anticipating scheduled feeding. The body's capacity to remain functional between meals was not an accident. It was a requirement for survival in fluctuating environments. None of this implies that modern structured meals are inherently harmful. It simply clarifies that the biological template underlying human metabolism developed under conditions of irregular intake. The question of why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day finds part of its answer here. The body was built to manage uncertainty. Energy storage, hormonal regulation, and metabolic flexibility all point to an organism designed to endure variation. The predictable, evenly spaced meal system that many societies now consider normal represents a relatively recent overlay on a much older biological foundation. Beyond energy storage, there is another biological layer that helps explain why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, and it lies in the regulation of hunger itself. Hunger is not simply a clock-based reminder. It is a coordinated physiological process shaped by signals from the stomach, intestines, brain, and fat tissue. These signals evolved long before structured meal times existed. In ancestral environments, they responded to internal energy balance and external availability rather than to fixed social schedules. One of the key hormones involved in appetite regulation is ghrelin, often called the hunger hormone. Ghrelin levels tend to rise before expected meals and fall after eating. Modern research shows that ghrelin secretion can adapt to habitual patterns, meaning that if someone eats at regular times, the body may begin to anticipate those times. However, this adaptability itself suggests flexibility. The system is responsive, not rigid. In a foraging world without fixed daily meal categories, hunger signals would have been shaped by recent intake, physical exertion, and energy needs, rather than by a standardized breakfast, lunch, dinner cycle. Leptin, another important hormone, reflects longer-term energy stores in fat tissue. It communicates information about overall energy sufficiency to the brain. When fat stores are adequate, leptin levels are higher, helping to reduce appetite. When stores decline, leptin falls, increasing hunger and encouraging food-seeking behavior. This system operates over days and weeks, not just hours. It reinforces the idea that human metabolism evolved to maintain balance across time rather than to depend on evenly spaced daily meals. In environments where food availability fluctuated, a body that could integrate signals over varying intervals had a survival advantage. There is also the matter of blood glucose regulation. The brain depends heavily on a steady supply of glucose, yet humans are capable of maintaining stable blood sugar levels between meals through internal processes. The liver plays a central role, releasing stored glycogen and synthesizing glucose when intake pauses. This capacity allows normal cognitive and physical function during natural gaps between eating events. If 3 meals a day had been a biological requirement across deep time, we would expect to see greater fragility in these systems when intake is delayed. Instead, the body demonstrates resilience within a range of normal variation. When we return to the long timeline of Homo sapiens, nearly 200,000 years of predominantly foraging life, the significance of this flexibility becomes clearer. The majority of our species' evolutionary history unfolded without agriculture, without permanent settlements, and without structured meal schedules. The regulatory systems governing hunger and satiety were shaped during that extended period. They were not designed around modern institutional timetables, school lunches, or factory breaks. They were calibrated to fluctuating landscapes and cooperative food sharing. It is important to emphasize that this biological flexibility does not prescribe how modern individuals should eat. Contemporary environments differ greatly from Pleistocene ones. Food abundance, sedentary lifestyles, and processed products introduce new variables. The goal here is not to recommend abandoning structured meals, but to understand that such structures are cultural developments layered onto an older metabolic foundation. The reason humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day is not because they ignored hunger, but because their bodies were equipped to regulate energy across changing conditions. Appetite systems evolved to manage uncertainty, and they remain capable of adaptation. The modern expectation of fixed daily meals exists within a biological framework that is older, broader, and more flexible than the schedule itself. There is one further biological dimension that completes this picture, and it concerns how the body manages transitions between different fuel sources. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in conditions where food intake was not evenly distributed across the day. Because of this, the human body developed the capacity to switch between using recently consumed nutrients and drawing on internal reserves. This metabolic flexibility is a defining feature of human physiology, and it helps explain how our ancestors functioned without 3 structured meals a day. After eating, the body typically prioritizes the use of glucose derived from carbohydrates. Insulin facilitates the movement of glucose into cells, where it can be used immediately for energy or stored. When several hours pass without additional intake, insulin levels decline. The body gradually shifts toward releasing stored glycogen from the liver and increasing reliance on fatty acids from adipose tissue. In longer intervals, small amounts of ketone bodies may be produced as an additional fuel source for certain tissues, including the brain. These processes are well established in human metabolic research. What matters for our historical question is that these transitions occur naturally within the normal range of daily life. They do not require extreme deprivation. They are part of standard energy regulation. In ancestral environments, where eating was linked to success in hunting and gathering rather than to a fixed timetable, such transitions would have occurred regularly. A morning without food, followed by intake later in the day, would not have been unusual, nor would occasional longer gaps during travel or scarcity. The body's ability to maintain physical and cognitive function across these intervals was not an optional feature. It was essential for survival in variable climates. When we consider again the deep timeline of Homo sapiens, the contrast becomes clear. Agriculture, which began roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago in several regions of the world, introduced more consistent access to certain staple crops. Even then, daily intake patterns varied widely by culture and circumstance. The idea of a standardized 3-meal structure, synchronized across entire populations, became far more common in later settled and industrial societies. This means that for the overwhelming majority of our species' history, metabolic systems operated in environments where intake timing was fluid. Another important factor is energy expenditure. Early human life required frequent movement, walking long distances, carrying loads, constructing shelters, and processing food. Energy output fluctuated, and intake responded to those fluctuations. Modern physiology shows that the body adjusts appetite in relation to both recent activity and stored reserves. In a foraging world, these feedback loops operated without the influence of institutional schedules. Hunger rose and fell according to internal state and environmental opportunity. The persistence of metabolic flexibility today suggests continuity with that past. Humans remain capable of functioning between meals because the underlying systems were shaped in a world that demanded it. This does not imply that 3 meals a day are incompatible with human biology. Rather, it clarifies that such a pattern is one of many that the body can accommodate. The reason humans live 200,000 years without 3 meals a day is rooted in this adaptability. The human organism evolved to manage variation, shifting fuel sources, adjusting appetite, and maintaining balance across changing conditions. Structured meal timing is a relatively recent cultural layer, resting upon a biological foundation that is older and more elastic than the clock. When we widen the lens from biology to survival strategy, another layer of the answer begins to appear. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens did not live in environments designed for comfort. They lived in environments defined by risk. Climate shifted repeatedly during the Pleistocene. Glacial periods expanded and retreated. Rainfall patterns changed. Animal populations migrated or declined. In such a world, survival depended less on daily regularity and more on resilience. The absence of 3 meals a day was not simply a byproduct of ecological variability. It was part of a broader adaptive strategy shaped by uncertainty. Early humans faced multiple forms of risk at once: predation, injury, weather exposure, and food scarcity. Energy management became central to enduring these pressures. A body that required evenly spaced meals at fixed hours would have been fragile in this context. Instead, human physiology supported endurance. Energy could be stored, conserved, and deployed according to need. This capacity allowed groups to travel longer distances, to wait out unsuccessful hunts, and to respond to sudden opportunities. The question of why humans live 200,000 years without 3 meals a day cannot be separated from this larger survival framework. Risk was not evenly distributed across time. A successful hunt might dramatically reduce short-term risk by providing a large supply of calories. A failed attempt might increase uncertainty for days. The ability to tolerate variation in intake reduced the immediate danger posed by temporary scarcity. From an evolutionary perspective, individuals and groups that managed energy flexibly were more likely to reproduce and pass on their traits. Archaeological evidence of long-distance migration supports this interpretation. Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa and into diverse environments, including colder regions of Eurasia and eventually across land bridges into new continents. Such movements required sustained effort and the ability to cope with fluctuating food access. 3 evenly spaced daily meals would have been impractical during long travel across unfamiliar terrain. Instead, groups relied on episodic acquisition and shared resources. Survival depended on collective resilience, not on predictable individual feeding schedules. Energy conservation also played a role. In unpredictable environments, expending energy unnecessarily could be costly. Modern research on human metabolism shows that the body can adjust energy expenditure in response to intake levels. While this process is complex and influenced by many variables, it reflects a system shaped to navigate scarcity without immediate collapse. In ancestral settings, this capacity supported persistence through lean periods. It reduced the need for constant intake and allowed survival across seasonal fluctuations. Importantly, this does not suggest that ancient humans preferred hunger or that irregular eating was comfortable. It simply acknowledges that the human organism was capable of enduring it. Natural selection does not optimize for comfort. It favors survival and reproduction. The metabolic systems that enabled functioning without fixed daily meals were part of that adaptive toolkit. When agriculture and later industrial systems introduced greater regularity in food supply, human societies adapted culturally to those changes. Yet the deeper biological architecture remained grounded in a history of risk and variability. The reason humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day is intertwined with the fact that life itself was uncertain. Structured meal timing is easier to maintain in stable, settled societies. In contrast, the long evolutionary past of Homo sapiens was shaped by landscapes that demanded flexibility. The body and its energy systems reflect that long training in endurance. Risk in the ancestral world was rarely isolated to food alone. It was layered. Weather could shift suddenly. Herds could change migration routes. A water source could dry. In such conditions, the management of energy was inseparable from the management of uncertainty. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens navigated environments in which success on one day did not guarantee success on the next. The absence of 3 meals a day fits into this broader pattern of unpredictability. Regularity requires stability. Deep human history was defined by change. During the Pleistocene epoch, global climates oscillated between colder and warmer phases. These shifts influenced vegetation patterns, animal populations, and the distribution of edible plants. Archaeological layers from different periods show variations in tool types and animal remains, suggesting adaptation to changing prey and landscapes. When resources shifted geographically or seasonally, human groups followed. Movement itself disrupted any possibility of fixed daily meal routines. Eating was integrated into a flexible survival system, not organized as a stable daily ritual. Energy strategy in such a world favored buffering rather than strict timing. When food was available, it was consumed and shared. When it was scarce, stored energy supported continued function. The human capacity to store body fat, sometimes viewed negatively in modern contexts, likely served an adaptive role in this long era of variability. Fat tissue represents stored energy that can be mobilized during lean periods. Its evolutionary persistence suggests that the ability to endure intervals without food was not unusual but expected. When we return to the central question why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the answer again points to this expectation of fluctuation. A rigid feeding requirement would have reduced survival odds in environments where resources could not be scheduled. Even beyond climate and prey movement, social factors introduced uncertainty. Group size changed over time. Conflicts, injuries, and demographic shifts influenced labor distribution. In smaller bands, the loss of a skilled hunter could temporarily reduce food acquisition success. In such moments, reliance on previously stored energy and on group sharing would have been essential. Eating patterns adjusted to circumstance, not to predetermined hours. Modern physiological research supports the idea that humans can tolerate moderate intervals between meals without immediate harm, provided overall nutritional needs are met across time. This tolerance reflects systems shaped under ancestral conditions. It does not imply that prolonged deprivation is safe or beneficial, but it does highlight resilience within normal ranges of variability. The body's regulatory networks evolved to smooth the peaks and valleys of intake, aligning with an environment characterized by risk. Over tens of thousands of generations, this pattern became embedded in human biology. The expansion of Homo sapiens into diverse ecosystems from arid savannas to temperate forests demonstrates that flexibility in energy intake was compatible with survival across wide environmental ranges. The absence of 3 meals a day was not a cultural oversight. It was consistent with the demands of living in landscapes where stability could not be assumed. Only later, when agriculture reduced certain forms of uncertainty and settlement, anchored populations in one place, did more regular eating patterns begin to take hold. For most of human history, however, risk and variability defined daily life, and eating followed the same principle. There is another dimension of risk that shaped early human life, and it is quieter but just as powerful: the risk of miscalculation. In a world without written records, refrigeration, or large-scale storage, predicting exactly when the next reliable source of food would appear was difficult. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens relied on knowledge passed orally across generations, knowledge of migration routes, plant seasons, and water cycles. This knowledge reduced uncertainty, but it did not eliminate it. Weather anomalies, animal behavior changes, and ecological disruptions could still disrupt expectations. In such a world, resilience mattered more than precision. A daily requirement for 3 evenly spaced meals would have depended on a level of predictability that rarely existed. Instead, the human strategy favored tolerance and adjustment. When a hunt failed, the group did not collapse immediately. They relied on alternative foods, shared resources, or internal reserves. When a hunt succeeded, intake might temporarily increase. This uneven rhythm was not a flaw. It was a buffer against miscalculation. The body's capacity to endure gaps without losing essential function reduced the danger of imperfect prediction. This biological resilience worked alongside social resilience. Sharing practices, documented in archaeological contexts and observed in recent foraging societies, spread risk across the group. If one individual or subgroup was unsuccessful, others could compensate. Eating, therefore, reflected collective outcomes rather than individual schedules. 3 meals a day assume a stable, private food supply. In ancestral settings, food was often communal and contingent. The timing of intake depended on shared success, not personal planning. When we consider again why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, it becomes clear that rigid regularity would have offered little advantage under such conditions. Flexibility allowed adaptation to error, to surprise, and to shifting circumstances. Natural selection favored systems that could absorb shocks. Metabolic processes that maintained blood glucose, mobilized fat stores, and regulated appetite across fluctuating intake provided a safeguard against temporary disruption. These systems did not require constant feeding to function. They were shaped in a context where variation was normal. It is also important to remember that early human life involved long periods of travel. Migration out of Africa and into new territories unfolded over thousands of years. Travel introduces uncertainty. Food sources along new routes may be unfamiliar. Delays and detours are inevitable. In such settings, strict daily feeding routines would have been difficult to sustain. Groups needed to adjust to what they encountered. The absence of 3 meals a day was therefore consistent with a mobile, exploratory species. This does not romanticize hardship. Periods of scarcity were real, and not all groups survived them. Archaeological evidence shows population bottlenecks and shifts that likely reflect environmental stress. But the persistence of Homo sapiens as a species indicates that, on balance, the adaptive strategies worked. The body and social structures together formed a system capable of navigating risk without reliance on rigid daily intake patterns. Over tens of thousands of years, this approach became part of the inherited human condition. Only much later, in more stable agricultural and industrial contexts, would regular meal timing become both possible and culturally reinforced. For the vast majority of our evolutionary history, survival required flexibility, and eating followed that rule. When we look at early human life through the lens of age and generation, another quiet explanation begins to emerge. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in small, interdependent groups composed of children, adults, and elders. Each age group carried different capacities and vulnerabilities. Infants required frequent feeding. Young children depended heavily on adult provision. Adults carried the primary burden of hunting, gathering, and protection. Elders often contributed knowledge, childcare, and social stability. In such a structure, eating patterns were shaped not only by environment and risk, but by the needs of a mixed population. The idea of 3 standardized meals assumes a uniform daily rhythm across all members of a household. In ancestral groups, rhythms were more layered. Infants and very young children would have fed more frequently, particularly through breastfeeding, which operates on demand rather than on fixed clock intervals. Lactation itself reflects adaptation to fluctuating food environments. Human breast milk production adjusts to maternal intake over time, but it does not require the mother to consume 3 evenly spaced meals each day to function. This suggests a system built for resilience across variation. For adults, food acquisition often required extended periods away from camp. Hunting parties might travel for hours or longer before returning. Gathering expeditions could take time, especially in arid or sparsely vegetated landscapes. During these activities, intake would depend on what could be carried or found along the way. It is unlikely that individuals paused at precise intervals for structured meals. Instead, energy intake was coordinated around the success and timing of collective effort. When we ask why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the demographic structure of early groups provides part of the answer. The needs of infants were met through frequent, flexible feeding. The needs of adults were met through episodic acquisition and shared distribution. There was no central kitchen producing synchronized portions for each member at fixed hours. Instead, food moved through the group according to availability and role. Archaeological evidence supports the presence of multi-generational living arrangements in many prehistoric contexts. Hearth sites and dwelling remains indicate shared spaces where food was processed and consumed collectively. Yet even within these communal settings, intake likely varied by age, status, and recent activity. An injured hunter might receive priority distribution. A nursing mother might be supported by shared resources. Eating was responsive to circumstance, not locked into uniform scheduling. This flexible distribution reduced vulnerability. If one adult returned empty-handed, the group did not immediately face collapse. Shared food networks smoothed short-term fluctuations. At the same time, no evidence suggests that groups organized their days around 3 fixed communal meals in the way many modern households do. The demographic complexity of early human life required adaptability rather than uniformity. Over thousands of generations, this age-structured system shaped expectations within the body and mind. Hunger signals, energy expenditure, and food sharing evolved within communities where intake was negotiated across roles and life stages. The absence of 3 meals a day was consistent with a society in which needs were diverse and resources unpredictable. Only much later, as settlements stabilized and households formalized routines, would meal timing begin to align more strictly across generations. For most of human history, eating reflected the fluid interplay between age, effort, and environment. Within these small ancestral groups, another quiet force shaped eating patterns: interdependence. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens survived not as isolated individuals but as cooperative networks. Food moved through relationships. A successful hunter did not consume an entire animal alone. A skilled gatherer did not store away all collected plants for private use. Archaeological evidence from multiple prehistoric sites shows signs of shared processing areas and communal hearths, suggesting that consumption was embedded in social exchange. In such a system, eating was relational rather than strictly scheduled. This interdependence altered the meaning of hunger. An individual's immediate lack of food did not automatically result in isolation or collapse, because access to resources was mediated by the group. Sharing practices reduced the daily urgency for each person to secure 3 separate, evenly spaced meals. Instead, the group functioned as a buffer. When food was abundant, it was distributed. When it was limited, intake adjusted collectively. The rhythm of eating followed shared outcomes rather than individual clocks. Anthropological studies of more recent foraging societies provide insight into how this may have functioned. In several documented cases, food distribution occurred soon after acquisition, often with attention to social bonds, kinship ties, and reciprocal obligations. The timing of meals was therefore influenced by when resources became available and when preparation was completed. It was not typically determined by abstract timekeeping. While patterns varied between cultures, the absence of a universal 3-meal structure remains a consistent observation. When we return to the central question, why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the cooperative structure of early society offers another explanation. A fixed daily meal schedule assumes both individual storage and stable supply. In ancestral communities, storage capacity was limited, especially before the development of large-scale preservation techniques. Perishable foods needed to be consumed relatively quickly. This encouraged episodic communal eating, rather than evenly divided rations across the day. Interdependence also meant that eating was integrated into social events. The return of a hunting party, the processing of gathered foods, or the maintenance of a shared fire created moments of collective consumption. These events were shaped by success and opportunity. They did not necessarily occur at consistent daily intervals. Over time, this pattern reinforced flexibility. Appetite regulation, energy expenditure, and social cooperation co-evolved within a framework where intake responded to shared circumstances. It is important to recognize that this system did not eliminate hardship. There were undoubtedly periods when resources were scarce and hunger was real. However, the cooperative network increased resilience by distributing risk across the group. 3 meals a day were not required to maintain cohesion or survival. What was required was adaptability and mutual support. Across tens of thousands of years, this relational approach to food shaped human expectations and biology. The idea of individual plates served at fixed hours would have been unfamiliar in much of our deep history. Instead, eating was woven into the fabric of cooperation, fluctuating with environment and effort. Only later, when agriculture and permanent settlement introduced more consistent storage and privatization of resources, would meal timing become more uniform within households. For most of human evolution, food was a shared resource managed collectively, and its timing reflected that shared reality. There is one more generational layer that deepens this picture, and it concerns memory and learning. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens relied on knowledge transmitted across age groups to navigate landscapes and secure food. Elders remembered migration routes, seasonal plant cycles, and water sources. Adults applied that knowledge through labor and coordination. Children observed and gradually learned the rhythms of the land. In such a system, food timing was guided by ecological understanding rather than by abstract scheduling. The day unfolded according to opportunity, and each generation absorbed that flexibility as normal. This long continuity shaped expectations about eating. A child growing up in a foraging society would not learn that food appears at fixed hours by default. Instead, the child would learn that food appears when effort and environment align. That lesson, repeated over thousands of generations, reinforced a cultural and biological tolerance for variation. Hunger was understood as a signal within a broader landscape, not as a disruption of a rigid timetable. When we ask why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, this intergenerational transmission becomes part of the answer. Structured daily meals require more than food supply. They require shared agreement about time. In early human societies, time was experienced through natural cycles: sunrise, heat, cooling air, seasonal shifts. Knowledge of when to hunt or gather was tied to these cues. Meal timing, therefore, followed the logic of ecology rather than the logic of the clock. Across Africa and later across Eurasia and other continents, early humans adapted to diverse habitats. Some regions offered more consistent plant availability. Others required greater reliance on hunting. Yet across this diversity, the common thread remained responsiveness to environment. There is no archaeological evidence from the deep past suggesting that entire communities paused uniformly 3 times each day for standardized meals. What we do find are signs of repeated use of certain sites, hearths indicating cooking, and tools associated with food processing. These findings show that eating was central to life, but they do not indicate rigid daily segmentation. The generational structure of early societies supported this fluidity. Elders who survived into later life did so because the system, though variable, was sustainable enough to allow reproduction and knowledge transfer. This suggests that consistent 3-meal routines were not necessary for long-term species survival. What was necessary was the capacity to adjust across changing conditions and across life stages. Even reproductive patterns intersect with this theme. Pregnancy and lactation required reliable nutrition over time, but not necessarily at evenly spaced daily intervals. The human body is capable of adjusting to moderate fluctuations in intake while maintaining reproductive function under favorable conditions. This resilience would have been critical in ancestral contexts where perfect regularity was impossible. Over tens of thousands of years, these generational patterns reinforced a shared understanding. Eating was part of life's flow, not its organizer. Only much later, with the rise of agriculture, surplus storage, and increasingly formalized daily routines, would meal timing begin to standardize within households and communities. For most of our evolutionary history, the rhythms of age, learning, and environment shaped when food was found and consumed. 3 meals a day were not required for continuity across generations. Adaptability was. For nearly 190,000 years of Homo sapiens history, eating patterns were shaped by movement, risk, cooperation, and ecology. Then, relatively recently in evolutionary terms, a profound shift began. Around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, in several regions of the world, some human groups began to cultivate plants and domesticate animals. This transition, often called the agricultural revolution or Neolithic transition, did not occur everywhere at once, nor did it immediately transform all societies. But over time, it introduced a new relationship between humans and food, one based less on immediate acquisition and more on planned production. To understand why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, and why that pattern later began to change, we must examine what agriculture altered. Cultivation allowed certain crops, such as early forms of wheat and barley in the Near East, millet in parts of Asia, and maize later in the Americas, to be grown in predictable locations. Domesticated animals could be kept near settlements. For the first time in human history, food production became tied to a fixed place rather than to constant mobility. This shift reduced some forms of uncertainty, although it introduced others such as vulnerability to drought or crop failure. Permanent or semi-permanent settlements emerged. Storage structures appear in the archaeological record, including granaries and clay vessels designed to hold surplus grain. With storage came the possibility of distributing food more evenly across days. Grain, unlike fresh meat or gathered fruits, could be preserved for extended periods if kept dry and protected. This technological and social development changed the daily rhythm of eating. However, it is important to remain precise. Early agricultural societies did not instantly adopt a universal three-meal structure. Dietary patterns varied widely depending on region, climate, and cultural practice. Many early farmers likely still experienced seasonal shortages and irregular intake. Yet the foundation for more predictable daily meals had been laid. Food was now increasingly available in a controlled, stored form. When people no longer needed to travel long distances daily in search of resources, their time began to organize differently. Agricultural labor followed seasonal cycles, planting, tending, harvesting, but within settled communities, daily tasks became more localized. The potential for shared cooking spaces and repeated daily preparation increased. Over generations, this stability allowed routines to solidify. When we revisit the central question, why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the timeline offers clarity. The overwhelming majority of our species' history unfolded before agriculture. Structured food production represents a relatively recent chapter. It introduced the possibility of regularity but did not erase the deep biological systems shaped during millennia of variability. Even as agricultural societies grew, they existed atop bodies evolved for flexibility. The agricultural revolution marks the beginning of a gradual cultural layering over an older metabolic foundation. 3 meals a day would become more common in certain societies over time, but this development was contingent on storage, settlement, and labor organization. For most of human history, none of these conditions existed. The shift toward agriculture did not rewrite human biology. It altered the environment in which that biology operated. The story of 3 meals a day begins here not as an ancient necessity, but as a response to new forms of stability introduced by farming. As agricultural life settled into valleys and plains, another transformation quietly unfolded. The relationship between labor and time began to change. For nearly 200,000 years, human activity followed migration patterns, daylight, and ecological opportunity. With farming, effort became anchored to specific plots of land. Fields required preparation, irrigation in some regions, protection from animals, and coordinated harvesting. This anchoring did not immediately produce modern schedules, but it began to compress daily activity into more predictable cycles. When people lived near their crops and animals year-round, food preparation could occur with greater regularity. Grain needed grinding. Dough required shaping and cooking. Domesticated animals could be milked at intervals. These tasks often repeated daily. Archaeological findings from early agricultural settlements reveal grinding stones worn smooth from repeated use, ovens built into dwellings, and storage facilities positioned close to living spaces. Such evidence suggests increasing routine in food preparation. Routine in preparation made routine in eating more possible. It is important to emphasize that this shift unfolded gradually across centuries and differed by region. Early farmers still faced crop failures, pests, and climate variability. Famine remained a reality in many areas throughout history. Yet compared to highly mobile foraging groups, settled agricultural communities experienced a different kind of predictability. Food did not need to be located anew each day across vast terrain. Instead, it was grown nearby, harvested in season, and stored. This reduced some of the day-to-day uncertainty that had characterized earlier eras. When we ask again why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the contrast becomes sharper. In a foraging world, mobility and unpredictability limited the feasibility of rigid meal timing. In a farming world, proximity to stored staples increased the feasibility of repeated daily preparation. Households could organize their work around tending fields and caring for animals. Eating began to cluster around work rhythms rather than around unpredictable acquisition events. In many early agrarian societies, historical records and later ethnographic accounts suggest that people often consumed a morning meal before field work, food during midday rest, and a more substantial meal in the evening. These patterns varied widely and were influenced by climate and cultural norms, but they reflect the growing alignment between labor routines and eating times. The possibility of 3 meals a day became more realistic when communities remained in one place and managed their own stored supply. However, this development remained cultural rather than biological. The human body had already evolved under conditions of flexibility. Agriculture altered the external structure of food access, not the internal design of metabolism. Even within farming societies, meal timing was not uniform across all classes or regions. Access depended on harvest success, land ownership, and social hierarchy. What changed most fundamentally was the capacity to plan. Food production allowed communities to anticipate future intake with greater confidence than foraging alone could provide. This confidence gradually reshaped daily habits. Yet in the long arc of human history, this agricultural chapter represents a small fraction of time. For the vast majority of our species' existence, structured daily meals were neither practical nor necessary. Farming introduced a new possibility, but it did not erase the deep evolutionary background that preceded it. As agricultural communities matured, the effects of storage and settlement extended beyond simple availability. They began to influence social organization, hierarchy, and daily structure. When surplus grain could be accumulated, it could also be counted, protected, taxed, or redistributed. Archaeological discoveries from early farming societies in regions such as the Fertile Crescent, parts of East Asia, and Mesoamerica reveal increasingly complex storage systems and emerging administrative structures. Surplus changed not only how food was eaten, but how societies were organized around it. With stored staples available within or near the household, the daily preparation of food became more standardized. Grinding grain into flour, baking bread, or cooking porridge required repeated effort but not daily hunting success. The presence of stored carbohydrates made it possible to prepare food at similar times each day, particularly when labor routines were shared across a community. Over generations, this repetition fostered expectations. Eating began to align with agricultural work cycles, morning sustenance before tending fields, midday pauses during labor, and evening meals after tasks were completed. These rhythms were not universal, and they differed by climate and culture, but the structural possibility of regular meals became embedded in settled life. When we revisit the central question, why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the contrast is now fully visible. For nearly all of human existence, there were no granaries, no permanent ovens, no fields of cultivated grain tied to a single location. Without these elements, rigid daily meal structures were impractical. Agriculture introduced them gradually, yet even as these patterns emerged, they did not immediately resemble modern expectations. In many early farming societies, daily intake could still vary with harvest yields, seasonal workload, and social class. The poorest members of agricultural communities often experienced irregular or insufficient access, despite the presence of surplus elsewhere. Structured meals depended not only on storage but also on distribution and social equity. Another significant development accompanied agriculture: population growth. Settled communities supported larger populations than small foraging bands. With increased density came new forms of coordination. Shared labor schedules and communal tasks encouraged synchronization in daily routines, including eating. Over time, as villages grew into towns and towns into early cities, coordination intensified. This synchronization laid groundwork for more widely shared mealtimes within households and communities. Yet it is essential to recognize the scale of this transformation within the broader timeline of Homo sapiens. Agriculture began roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, a small fraction compared to the nearly 200,000 years that preceded it. The biological systems regulating hunger and metabolism were shaped primarily during the far longer foraging era. Agriculture altered the context in which those systems operated, but it did not redesign them. 3 meals a day, where they appeared, were cultural adaptations to new economic and social realities. They were not ancestral biological requirements suddenly discovered. In settled societies, eating could become regular because food supply was managed more deliberately. But beneath that regularity remained a body evolved in variability. The emergence of more structured daily meals marks a turning point in human history. Yet it rests upon a much older evolutionary foundation shaped without them. As agricultural societies grew more complex, storage did more than stabilize food supply. It reshaped the physical landscape of daily life. Granaries, storage pits, clay vessels, and later larger communal storehouses became central features of settlements. Archaeological excavations in early farming regions show deliberate construction designed to protect grain from moisture, pests, and theft. These structures represent a turning point in the human relationship with food. For nearly 200,000 years, intake depended on what could be gathered or hunted within reach. With storage, food could be accumulated in advance and accessed repeatedly across days and months. This shift made regular eating not only possible, but increasingly practical. Grain, once harvested and dried, could be portioned out in measured amounts. Unlike perishable meat or seasonal fruits, stored staples could be prepared in small, consistent quantities. This technological development encouraged repetition. If grain was available each morning, it could be ground and cooked each morning. If animals were kept in enclosures, milk could be obtained at similar intervals. Food timing gradually became less dependent on ecological unpredictability and more dependent on household routine. When we consider again why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the answer lies partly in the absence of such storage systems during the vast foraging era. Without the ability to preserve large quantities of staple foods, intake followed acquisition events. Storage introduced continuity across days. It reduced the need to rely solely on immediate success in hunting or gathering. Over generations, this continuity allowed daily life to become more segmented. Morning, midday, and evening could acquire distinct roles in the preparation and consumption of food. However, it is important to avoid oversimplification. Early agricultural communities were still vulnerable to crop failure, drought, and spoilage. Storage mitigated risk, but did not eliminate it. Moreover, meal structures varied across regions and cultures. Some societies emphasized one main daily meal, others two, and some gradually adopted patterns resembling 3. The key transformation was not the number itself, but the possibility of consistency. The presence of surplus also allowed differentiation within society. Elites, laborers, and artisans might have experienced different degrees of access and routine. Written records from later ancient civilizations, such as those in Mesopotamia and Egypt, suggest increasingly formalized distributions of rations tied to work roles. These records reveal that food allocation could be measured and scheduled, especially in organized labor systems. Such documentation appears only after writing systems developed, long after the majority of human evolutionary history had passed. Storage also altered psychological expectations. When food is visibly present and secured, anticipation changes. Access feels less contingent on immediate environmental success. This psychological shift may have contributed to more regular daily consumption patterns over time. Yet beneath these emerging routines remained a biological framework shaped during tens of thousands of years without them. The reason humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day is rooted in that deeper history of mobility and unpredictability. Storage marks a turning point, but it does not redefine the long arc that preceded it. It represents a cultural adaptation layered onto a species whose metabolic systems evolved in a world where food could not be stockpiled in advance. The appearance of more structured eating patterns in settled societies reflects technological and social innovation, not a sudden discovery of biological necessity. As storage systems expanded and settlements grew into organized towns, another shift quietly strengthened the structure of daily meals, the division of labor. In early foraging societies, most adults participated directly in food acquisition. In agricultural communities, tasks became increasingly specialized. Some individuals focused on farming specific crops, others tended animals, and still others developed crafts, trade, or administrative roles. This specialization reduced the direct link between each individual and immediate food procurement. Instead of hunting or gathering daily, many people depended on exchange, wages in kind, or redistributed grain. This reorganization of labor influenced when and how food was consumed. When work became concentrated in fields, workshops, or construction sites, eating began to align with coordinated labor periods. Archaeological and historical records from later ancient societies suggest that workers often received rations or paused collectively during certain parts of the day. In Mesopotamia, for example, clay tablets from early city-states document grain distributions tied to labor assignments. In ancient Egypt, evidence from worker settlements indicates organized provisioning systems for those building large state projects. While these records are far more recent than the deep foraging past, they illustrate a growing connection between structured work and structured meals. When we return to the question of why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the contrast becomes clear. In mobile hunter-gatherer life, work and food acquisition were intertwined and unpredictable. In agricultural and proto-urban settings, work could be scheduled more reliably. Fields required attention at certain times. Irrigation systems needed maintenance. Construction projects followed coordinated plans. As time became organized around shared labor, eating naturally began to cluster around breaks in that labor. This clustering encouraged repetition. A morning meal before work, food during a midday pause, and an evening meal after tasks were completed became practical arrangements in many settled contexts. However, these developments were gradual and varied widely by culture and climate. Not all agricultural societies adopted identical patterns, and many populations continued to experience seasonal variability. Yet the structural possibility of 3 regular meals was now embedded in economic organization. Labor rhythms reinforced food rhythms. Importantly, this transformation remained cultural rather than biological. The human body had already evolved over nearly 200,000 years in environments without such scheduling. Hunger regulation and metabolic flexibility continued to operate according to energy balance and internal signals. What changed was the external framework within which those signals were interpreted. As societies became more complex, expectations about when one should eat began to take shape. Social norms developed alongside economic systems. Mealtime could become a shared marker of daily order. Still, this represented a relatively recent layer in human history. The vast span of evolutionary time before agriculture left a deeper imprint on human physiology than the few millennia of structured agrarian life. The emergence of more regular daily meals reflects the coordination of labor and storage, not a fundamental redesign of the species. For most of our existence, such coordination was neither possible nor necessary. As settled communities evolved into early states and cities, another subtle reinforcement of structured eating began to take shape: the formalization of daily order. With writing systems, administrative oversight, and increasingly centralized authority, time itself became more regulated. Calendars were developed to track planting seasons, taxation cycles, and religious observances. While these systems did not yet resemble modern clock-based precision, they introduced a new layer of shared temporal awareness. When time becomes coordinated across larger populations, daily routines tend to align more closely. Food consumption gradually became part of that alignment. Written records from later ancient societies indicate that rations were sometimes distributed at regular intervals, particularly for laborers, soldiers, and temple workers. These distributions were measured and recorded, reflecting an emerging bureaucratic approach to sustenance. When food allocation is standardized, eating patterns begin to standardize as well. This does not mean that every household in every early city consumed 3 identical meals per day. Historical variation remained wide. Yet the groundwork for habitual daily segmentation was being laid through administration and collective organization. In contrast, for nearly 200,000 years before agriculture and urbanization, there was no centralized authority coordinating daily intake. No written records instructed communities to eat at specific hours. Time was experienced locally and organically. Hunger responded to energy need and environmental opportunity, not to civic regulation. When we consider why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, this absence of formal timekeeping and administration is crucial. Structured meals require both available food and shared temporal agreement. In early foraging societies, neither condition was consistently present. As agricultural states matured, religious and cultural customs also began to influence meal timing. Rituals, fasting periods, and communal feasts introduced collective frameworks around eating. Some traditions formalized morning or evening meals in relation to prayer or labor cycles. These customs further embedded repetition into daily life. Over generations, repetition became expectation. Eating at certain times could come to symbolize order, discipline, or community belonging. Yet even at this stage, the biological foundation of Homo sapiens remained rooted in a far older past. The body's metabolic systems had been shaped across tens of thousands of years in environments without bureaucratic scheduling. Structured meals were cultural overlays responding to new economic and social realities. They did not redefine the underlying evolutionary design. It is also important to note that access remained uneven. Elites often experienced greater regularity and abundance, while labourers and marginalised populations faced fluctuation. The ideal of evenly spaced daily meals was not universally realised, even within organised states. Stability increased compared to the foraging era, but variability persisted. The gradual formalisation of daily order represents another step in the long shift from ecological responsiveness to social coordination. As settlements expanded and institutions strengthened, eating patterns increasingly reflected collective systems rather than immediate environmental uncertainty. Yet in the grand timeline of human history, this transformation occupies only a brief span. For the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, 3 meals a day were neither structured nor required. The evolution of administrative time and organised labour made regular meals feasible, but feasibility does not equal ancestral necessity. If agriculture introduced the possibility of more regular meals, the industrial era intensified that regularity in a way no previous period had. Beginning in parts of Europe in the 18th century and gradually spreading to other regions, industrialization reorganized daily life around mechanical time. Factories operated on shifts. Work hours were measured precisely. Clocks became central tools of coordination. For the first time in human history, large populations synchronized their activities according to standardized hours rather than to seasonal light or agricultural tasks alone. This transformation reshaped eating patterns in profound ways. In earlier agrarian societies, work rhythms were often influenced by daylight and seasonal demands. Although routines existed, there was still flexibility tied to climate and harvest cycles. Industrial labor required punctual arrival, sustained activity during designated hours, and coordinated breaks. When workers gathered in factories or mines, meal timing had to align with the structure of shifts. Midday breaks became institutionalized. Morning and evening meals formed around departure and return from work. 3 daily eating periods increasingly fit the needs of industrial schedules. When we revisit the central question, why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the contrast is stark. For nearly all of our species' evolutionary past, time was ecological. With industrialization, time became mechanical. The body, shaped across millennia of flexibility, now operated within rigid frameworks. Eating adapted to those frameworks because social survival required conformity to work schedules. Over time, this alignment became normalized. Breakfast before work, lunch during a fixed break, and dinner after the workday ended formed a stable pattern in many industrialized societies. Technological changes also supported this structure. Improved food preservation methods, including canning and later refrigeration, made it easier to store and prepare food in advance. Urbanization concentrated populations in cities where food distribution systems became increasingly organized. Markets operated on regular hours. Bakeries and shops opened and closed predictably. This predictability reinforced daily meal repetition. However, it is important to remember that this development represents only a very recent chapter in the 200,000-year story of Homo sapiens. Industrialization spans roughly 2 to 3 centuries in its most intense forms, a brief moment compared to the tens of thousands of years of foraging and early agriculture. The biological systems regulating hunger, metabolism, and energy balance were not redesigned during this period. They continued to reflect the much older evolutionary context in which irregular intake was common. The industrial clock did not create new human physiology, it created new expectations. Children were taught to eat at certain hours, schools scheduled lunch breaks, military and factory systems distributed rations at fixed times. Over generations, this repetition shaped cultural norms about what constitutes a proper day of eating. 3 meals became not just practical, but socially reinforced. Yet beneath this modern arrangement remains the deeper evolutionary inheritance. The reason humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day is that our species developed under conditions of environmental variability and metabolic flexibility. Industrial society introduced a powerful overlay of synchronization, but it did not erase the biological design forged in a far older world. As industrialization advanced through the 19th and 20th centuries, the synchronization of work and meals extended beyond factories into schools, military institutions, and urban households. Time was no longer only mechanical, it became institutional. Bells signaled the start and end of shifts. School children were given designated lunch periods. Soldiers received rations at scheduled intervals. These practices reinforced the idea that eating should occur at predictable hours shared by many people at once. What began as an adaptation to factory labor gradually shaped broader cultural expectations. In pre-industrial societies, meal timing could still vary by region, climate, and occupation. Farmers might eat earlier or later depending on daylight and season. Artisans working from home might pause when convenient. Industrial labor reduced such flexibility. When hundreds of workers operated machinery simultaneously, breaks had to be coordinated. A standardized midday pause became efficient. Over time, this pause was labeled and normalized as lunch. Morning and evening meals formed around the boundaries of work shifts. The structure of 3 daily eating periods fit neatly within the emerging framework of industrial timekeeping. Technological developments further strengthened this pattern. The expansion of railways and later refrigerated transport improved food distribution across cities and nations. Markets stocked goods consistently. Urban dwellers could purchase bread, dairy, and preserved foods on predictable schedules. The availability of ready supplies reduced dependence on immediate preparation from scratch. It also made repeated daily consumption easier to maintain. Refrigeration, in particular, allowed leftovers to be stored safely, smoothing intake across days without the urgency that characterized earlier eras. When we return to the long arc of human history, the scale of this transformation becomes clear. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens operated without synchronized clocks, institutional schedules, or widespread food preservation. Hunger responded to exertion and availability. Eating followed opportunity. Industrial society replaced opportunity with timetable. The question of why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day now intersects with another question. How quickly can cultural systems reshape daily habits compared to the slower pace of biological evolution? The human body did not undergo fundamental metabolic redesign in the brief span of industrial history. The hormonal and energy regulation systems described earlier remain in place. What changed was the social interpretation of hunger. Feeling hungry outside designated times could come to be viewed as inconvenient or improper. Conversely, eating at prescribed hours became associated with discipline and normalcy. This cultural shift was reinforced by institutions and eventually by public health messaging emphasizing regular meals. Yet it is important to recognize that industrial synchronization was not universal from the start. Rural populations often retained more flexible patterns. Even within cities, socioeconomic differences influenced access and routine. The widespread expectation of 3 meals a day became most entrenched in societies where industrial labor dominated daily life. The industrial era therefore represents an acceleration of regular meal structuring, building upon the foundations laid by agriculture and storage. But it remains a thin layer when compared to the immense time span of human evolutionary development. The body shaped in a world without fixed daily meals now operates in a world governed by coordinated hours. The tension between those two timelines is part of the story that continues into modern life. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the structure of 3 daily meals had become embedded not only in workplaces and institutions, but in domestic life. Urban housing was increasingly designed around kitchens as permanent central spaces. Cookbooks began to standardize recipes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Newspapers and advertisements reinforced the idea that a well-ordered household served food at regular hours. What had begun as a practical alignment with labor schedules evolved into a cultural norm associated with stability, discipline, and modernity. In many industrialized societies, 3 meals a day came to symbolize proper routine. This development marked a significant departure from the long evolutionary background of Homo sapiens. For nearly 200,000 years, eating patterns were shaped by ecological unpredictability, cooperative sharing, and metabolic flexibility. Now, within just a few generations, predictability was no longer rare. It was expected. Food supply chains delivered staples to urban centers with increasing reliability. Refrigeration, improved preservation methods, and commercial bakeries reduced dependence on daily hunting or seasonal harvest. Families could plan meals days in advance. Children grew up associating specific hours with specific foods. Over time, the expectation of 3 meals became self-reinforcing. Hunger often aligned with habit, because appetite hormones can adapt to repeated timing cues. When meals occur regularly, the body begins to anticipate them. This adaptability, however, reflects flexibility rather than original design. The underlying metabolic systems evolved during tens of thousands of years in which such rigid timing did not exist. The industrial and post-industrial eras introduced structure at a speed far faster than biological evolution could respond. When we revisit the question of why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the contrast with modern life becomes especially sharp. The vast majority of our species' history unfolded without synchronized clocks, centralized distribution networks, or cultural expectations of evenly spaced meals. 3 daily eating periods are a product of settlement, storage, labor coordination, and eventually industrial timekeeping. They are historically recent, yet because they are now widespread in many societies, they can appear natural and timeless. This perception can obscure the deeper evolutionary context. The human body did not originate within a breakfast, lunch, dinner framework. It originated in a world where intake was shaped by movement, risk, sharing, and availability. Modern scheduling overlays that older foundation. It does not erase it. Even in contemporary societies, variations remain. Shift workers, pastoral communities, and many traditional cultures follow patterns that diverge from strict 3-meal structures. This diversity reminds us that structured daily meals are cultural arrangements rather than universal biological imperatives. The industrial period intensified regularity and helped standardize it across large populations, but it represents only a brief chapter in a much longer story. Beneath the clock-governed day remains a body shaped in deep time. Understanding that layered history helps explain how a practice so familiar today could have been absent for nearly all of human existence. As the 20th century progressed into the 21st, another transformation layered itself onto the structure of 3 meals a day: constant access. Industrialization had synchronized work and eating. Modern globalization and technological advancement expanded food availability beyond any previous boundary. Supermarkets operate long hours. Processed foods can be stored for extended periods. Restaurants, delivery services, and convenience stores make intake possible at nearly any time. In many urban environments, food is no longer tied tightly to daylight, harvest, or even work shifts. It is accessible on demand. This development represents a profound departure from the conditions under which Homo sapiens evolved. For nearly 200,000 years, access to food required effort, cooperation, and environmental knowledge. Even during agricultural and early industrial periods, preparation and acquisition still imposed limits. In contrast, modern systems often remove immediate ecological constraints. The question of why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day now expands into a related observation. Not only were 3 structured meals absent for most of our history, but constant snacking and round-the-clock availability were even more absent. Contemporary food systems can blur the boundaries between meals. In many societies, eating occurs outside traditional breakfast, lunch, and dinner times. Snacks, packaged foods, and beverages provide additional calories throughout the day. This pattern reflects economic abundance and technological innovation rather than biological necessity. The metabolic systems shaped during the long foraging era remain fundamentally the same. Hunger hormones respond to intake and energy balance, but they can also adapt to repeated cues. When food is frequently consumed, appetite regulation adjusts accordingly. Yet this adaptability does not erase the deeper evolutionary context in which intervals between eating were normal. It is important to approach this observation carefully. Modern food abundance has reduced the frequency of famine in many parts of the world and has contributed to improved survival rates in numerous regions. The shift toward consistent food availability has clear benefits. However, from a historical perspective, it represents a dramatic environmental change compressed into a few centuries. The body evolved across tens of thousands of years in landscapes defined by variability. Now it operates in environments where variability is often replaced by abundance. When we reflect again on why humans live 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the answer remains anchored in that long evolutionary backdrop. Structured daily meals emerged gradually through agriculture, storage, labor organization, and industrial synchronization. Constant access emerged even later. The human organism did not originate in a world of unlimited availability. It originated in a world where food required navigation of risk and effort. Modern life introduces a different form of challenge, abundance without ecological constraint. Understanding this contrast helps clarify how recent our current patterns truly are. The body's flexibility allowed survival without fixed daily meals for most of human history. Today, that same flexibility operates within conditions of unprecedented access. The historical arc from scarcity to structure to abundance is short compared to the immense span that came before. Beneath the supermarket aisle and the illuminated storefront remains an organism shaped by deep time. As access to food expanded in modern societies, another subtle change unfolded. The separation between hunger and necessity became less clear. For nearly 200,000 years, hunger functioned primarily as a survival signal. It indicated declining energy reserves and prompted action within an environment where acquisition required effort. In contemporary settings, however, food is often available regardless of immediate physiological need. Supermarkets, vending machines, and delivery services place calories within easy reach. Advertising and social cues can stimulate appetite independent of energy deficit. This shift alters the context in which hunger is experienced and interpreted. In ancestral environments, eating typically followed successful foraging or communal preparation. There were natural intervals shaped by distance traveled, time spent processing food, and cooperation within the group. Those intervals allowed metabolic systems to cycle between intake and internal energy use. Today, frequent exposure to palatable foods can compress or eliminate those intervals. The pattern of 3 meals a day, once reinforced by industrial schedules, may now coexist with additional eating between meals. The central question, why humans live 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, highlights how deeply different our original conditions were. Not only were meals unscheduled, but opportunities to eat were limited by environment and effort. Modern abundance reduces those constraints, yet the biological systems regulating appetite and energy remain largely continuous with the past. Hormonal responses to food, storage of excess calories as fat, and maintenance of blood glucose through internal regulation all evolved in a context of variability. When intake becomes more frequent than expenditure requires, the body responds according to those same systems. This does not imply moral judgment about modern eating patterns. It simply reflects the continuity of physiology across changing environments. Another factor influencing contemporary patterns is the globalization of food production. Crops grown in one region are transported across continents. Seasonal limitations are minimized by trade and preservation technologies. In earlier agricultural societies, even with storage, local climates strongly influenced diet throughout the year. Today, strawberries may be available in winter, and imported grains accessible year-round. This erodes the seasonal variability that once structured intake. The result is a more uniform and continuous food landscape. When we compare this to the long arc of human evolution, the contrast is striking. For most of our species' history, hunger aligned closely with energy need and environmental opportunity. 3 meals a day did not exist because ecological and social conditions did not support them. Now, not only are 3 meals common in many societies, but additional eating opportunities surround them. The shift from scarcity to abundance has occurred in a relatively brief span of time compared to evolutionary history. Yet the body still carries the metabolic architecture shaped in that older world. Understanding this helps clarify why our present expectations about food can feel natural, even though they are historically recent. The capacity to function without rigid meal timing once supported survival across deserts, forests, and ice ages. That capacity remains, even as modern systems provide constant access. Beneath contemporary abundance lies a physiology designed for fluctuation. As modern abundance reshapes daily life, another quiet shift emerges in how we perceive what is normal. In societies where 3 meals a day have been reinforced for generations, and where additional snacks are readily available, structured eating can feel biologically inevitable. Yet when we step back into the long timeline of Homo sapiens, that sense of inevitability dissolves. For nearly 200,000 years, human beings lived in conditions where access to food was variable, effortful, and deeply tied to environment. The body that developed in those conditions did not require rigid daily segmentation. It required adaptability. In contemporary settings, social cues often influence eating as strongly as internal hunger signals. Work breaks, school schedules, family routines, and marketing patterns create expectations around timing. When lunchtime arrives, many people eat whether or not strong physiological hunger is present. When evening comes, dinner marks closure of the day. These practices are not inherently problematic. They reflect cultural coordination and convenience. However, they illustrate how far modern patterns have moved from the ecological variability of the ancestral world. The central question why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day now reveals a deeper perspective. It is not merely about the absence of structured meals. It is about the difference between a species shaped in fluctuation and a culture shaped in synchronization. The body's metabolic systems continue to regulate blood glucose, store energy, and respond to appetite cues within broad ranges. They do not require precise clock alignment to function. The resilience that allowed early humans to migrate across continents and endure seasonal scarcity remains part of human physiology today. Modern research on circadian rhythms and metabolism shows that timing of food can influence certain health outcomes, but it also confirms that the body maintains flexibility within varied patterns. This flexibility is a legacy of evolutionary history. It reflects adaptation to conditions where intake timing could not be guaranteed. In contrast, the expectation of 3 evenly spaced meals each day rests on a foundation built by agriculture, reinforced by industrial labor, and amplified by modern abundance. The shift from ecological unpredictability to institutional regularity occurred rapidly in evolutionary terms. Yet cultural repetition has made it feel ancient. Recognizing this contrast does not require rejecting modern routines. It invites awareness. The human organism did not originate in kitchens governed by clocks. It originated in landscapes governed by season, risk, and cooperation. The 3-meal structure is a relatively recent cultural arrangement layered onto a far older biological template. When we acknowledge that most of human existence unfolded without it, we gain perspective on how adaptable the species has been. The capacity to live without rigid daily meals was not extraordinary. It was ordinary for the vast majority of our history. That ordinariness remains embedded in our physiology, even as our environments continue to change. When we reach this point in the story, we are no longer looking only at environment, storage, or labor. We are looking at continuity. Despite agriculture, despite industrialization, despite modern abundance, the human body remains fundamentally similar to the body that walked across African savannas nearly 200,000 years ago. Genetic change in Homo sapiens over the last 10,000 years has occurred, but it has not rewritten the core architecture of metabolism. The systems that regulate hunger, store energy, and manage fuel transitions are still those shaped during the far longer foraging era. This continuity helps answer the central question from another angle. Humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day because nothing in our biological design required them. The requirement emerged culturally, not evolutionarily. Modern metabolic research shows that the body maintains energy balance across time, not across fixed clock intervals. Blood glucose is stabilized through internal mechanisms. Fat stores provide longer-term reserves. Hormonal signaling integrates recent intake with stored energy and activity levels. These systems evolved under conditions where food timing could not be guaranteed. They are designed to smooth variability rather than to depend on strict regularity. Even today, Individuals can function with different meal frequencies, provided overall nutritional needs are met. This flexibility reflects deep evolutionary inheritance. It is important to avoid exaggeration. The human body does respond to consistent routines. Regular sleep and eating patterns can influence circadian rhythms and metabolic markers. However, responsiveness is not the same as dependence. The body adapts to repeated cues, but it does not collapse outside of a three-meal structure. That resilience is evidence of its older design. When we compare the timeline, the contrast remains striking. Nearly 200,000 years of human existence unfolded before agriculture. Roughly 10,000 years have included farming. Only a few centuries have included industrial clock discipline. The majority of metabolic shaping occurred in the first and longest phase. 3 meals a day occupy a narrow segment of history, yet cultural repetition can make recent patterns feel timeless. The continuity of biology also explains why variation persists across cultures today. Around the world, meal frequency differs. Some populations emphasize 2 larger meals, others include smaller portions spread throughout the day. Religious traditions sometimes prescribe fasting intervals. Despite this diversity, the underlying physiology remains shared. Humans continue to regulate energy through the same core mechanisms that supported survival in fluctuating environments. When we reflect on why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, we see that the answer lies not only in scarcity or mobility, but in sufficiency. The body was sufficient without rigid scheduling. It could store, mobilize, and adjust. That sufficiency enabled expansion across continents and survival through climatic extremes. Modern systems have introduced new patterns, but they rest upon an older foundation that remains intact. The clock may now guide daily meals, yet beneath that structure lives an organism shaped in a world where hunger followed the land, not the hour. Even as cultural patterns have shifted towards structured meals, the body continues to reveal traces of its deeper evolutionary past in subtle ways. One of the clearest examples lies in how humans respond to short-term changes in meal timing. When a meal is delayed, most healthy individuals do not experience immediate system failure. Blood glucose is maintained within a stable range through liver regulation. Stored glycogen is mobilized. Fatty acids begin to contribute more to energy production. Cognitive function may fluctuate slightly depending on context, but the organism remains operational. This capacity is not accidental. It reflects an adaptive history in which intervals between eating were common. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens survived in conditions where intake timing varied by necessity. The persistence of this resilience today is evidence of continuity. Modern nutritional science recognizes that humans can function across a range of eating patterns. Some people naturally prefer larger meals spaced farther apart. Others gravitate towards smaller, more frequent intake. While individual health conditions may influence what works best for a given person, the species as a whole retains flexibility. This flexibility aligns with the long foraging era, not solely with the agricultural or industrial phases that followed. If 3 evenly spaced meals were biologically mandatory, the range of tolerable variation would likely be far narrower. Instead, human metabolism demonstrates adaptability. This adaptability does not eliminate the influence of routine. Regular timing can entrain circadian rhythms and influence digestion and hormone release. Yet the ability to adjust when routines shift during travel, seasonal change, or altered work schedules reveals that the underlying system is not rigid. It is responsive. When we ask again why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the answer includes this enduring responsiveness. The body evolved in a landscape of uncertainty, and it retains the capacity to navigate moderate unpredictability. Another layer of continuity appears in the way hunger signals recalibrate over time. Research shows that ghrelin levels can adapt to habitual eating schedules, rising before expected meals. However, when patterns change, these signals gradually shift. This plasticity suggests that appetite regulation evolved to track availability rather than to enforce a fixed universal timetable. The system learns from context. In ancestral environments, context was defined by effort and environment. In modern environments, context is often defined by social schedule, yet the mechanism remains fundamentally the same. It adjusts. This enduring design underscores a broader perspective. 3 meals a day are not inherently unnatural, but they are not evolutionarily ancient either. They represent a cultural arrangement layered onto a metabolic architecture shaped across a much longer span of time. The resilience of that architecture explains how humans endured ice ages, migrations, and ecological shifts long before clocks or factories existed. It also explains why variation in meal frequency remains physiologically possible today. Beneath contemporary routines lies a body trained by deep history, a body capable of balance across changing patterns, not dependent on a single rigid format. There is one last thread of continuity to hold on to here, and it is the difference between biological necessity and cultural habit. A habit can feel like nature when it is repeated for long enough, taught early enough, and reinforced by the people around us. In many modern societies, 3 meals a day are not just common, they are expected. Children learn that a proper day has a morning meal, a midday meal, and an evening meal. Schools, workplaces, and family routines strengthen those expectations. Yet when we stretch our view across the full span of Homo sapiens history, that expectation is new. For nearly 200,000 years, humans lived without clocks that divided the day into uniform segments, without institutions that coordinated lunch breaks, and without stored staples that could be portioned out at predictable hours. The body that evolved through that long era did not encode breakfast, lunch, and dinner as requirements. It encoded the ability to keep functioning when timing was uncertain. Modern physiology makes that clear in several ways. Energy balance is regulated across time, not by a strict hourly ledger. The liver stabilizes blood glucose between eating events. Muscle and liver glycogen provide a short-term reserve, and fat tissue provides a longer-term reserve. Appetite signals rise and fall, but they are sensitive to context. They respond to recent intake, to activity, to stress, to sleep, and to learned cues. Research shows that the body can anticipate meals when meals are regular, yet it can also recalibrate when schedules change. That recalibration is not an exotic feature. It is what would be favored in environments where food arrived irregularly, where a successful hunt could shift intake later into the day, and where travel or weather could delay eating. When we ask why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, the answer is not that our ancestors ignored hunger, or that they possessed some mysterious toughness. The answer is that the human organism was shaped in a world where flexibility was a safer design than precision. 3 daily meals became feasible only when food supply and timekeeping became more stable, first with agriculture and storage, then more strongly with industrial work schedules. But feasibility is not the same as evolutionary need. The deeper design still shows through in the range of patterns the body can tolerate. Even today, people around the world eat in different ways. Some cultures emphasize 2 main meals. Some build the day around one large communal meal. Some include many small eating moments. Religious traditions sometimes introduce fasting periods that shift timing for days or weeks. Shift work and travel can disrupt the classic 3-meal rhythm. Across all this diversity, most healthy bodies adapt, not because modern life is simple, but because the underlying systems were built to manage variation. This perspective also helps keep the topic honest and grounded. It does not claim that any one pattern is best for everyone, and it does not turn deep history into a prescription. It simply clarifies what the long record suggests. Structured meal schedules are cultural tools that solve cultural problems, like coordinating work, schooling, and shared household routines. They are not ancient biological laws written into our species at the beginning. The body still carries a memory older than the clock. It carries a metabolism that can bridge gaps, a brain that can stay awake and attentive between eating events, and an appetite system that learns from its environment. When we recognize that, the modern habit of 3 meals a day becomes easier to place in its true scale. It is a recent layer, stable for some people, useful for many, but not the foundation of our evolutionary story. Underneath the routine remains the long training of our species, in which hunger was a signal shaped by landscape and circumstance, not a bell that rang at the same hour for everyone. Now, at the end of this long arc, the question returns in a quieter form. Why did humans live 200,000 years without 3 meals a day? The answer is no longer a single point about hunting or storage or factories. It is a layered understanding about time, environment, and design. For nearly all of our existence as a species, food was shaped by landscape. It appeared through effort, cooperation, and ecological rhythm. The body that carried Homo sapiens across Africa, into Eurasia, through ice ages and warming periods, was not dependent on evenly spaced daily intake. It was dependent on adaptability. That adaptability was not heroic. It was ordinary. It was built into the way we store energy, regulate hunger, and respond to change. Over tens of thousands of years, small bands moved across terrain without clocks, without standardized lunch breaks, without refrigerators. They survived not because they followed a precise feeding schedule, but because their biology allowed them to bridge uncertainty. When agriculture emerged, it introduced a new relationship with food. When industrialization followed, it introduced synchronized time. When modern abundance arrived, it introduced constant access. Each layer changed how humans organized eating. Yet none of those layers rewrote the deeper evolutionary template. 3 meals a day became common in many societies because they fit agricultural labor, factory shifts, and school timetables. They solved coordination problems. They supported routine. But they did not define the biological minimum required for survival. The human organism had already proven itself capable of endurance long before such structures appeared. This perspective offers something steady rather than dramatic. It does not argue that structured meals are wrong. It does not suggest that irregular eating is inherently superior. It simply restores scale. For 95% or more of our species' timeline, the pattern of breakfast, lunch, and dinner did not exist. And yet the species expanded, reproduced, created language, art, and culture. The absence of 3 meals a day did not prevent human flourishing in its early forms. Understanding this helps dissolve a common confusion between what is familiar and what is ancient. Familiar habits can feel natural because they are repeated daily. But natural, in the evolutionary sense, refers to the conditions under which a species was shaped. In that deeper sense, humans were shaped in variability. The capacity to tolerate gaps, to store surplus, to share resources, and to adjust appetite across shifting environments was the quiet foundation of survival. As we reach this point in the story, the modern world does not need to be rejected or romanticized. It can simply be seen more clearly. 3 meals a day are part of a recent chapter in human history. Beneath that chapter lies a much longer one, written in landscapes without clocks and in bodies built for flexibility. If our species learned to survive without rigid daily meals for nearly 200,000 years, what does that say about how adaptable we truly are today? If we sit with that question a little longer, another layer of meaning begins to emerge. The story of why humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day is not only about food, it is about the scale of human time. It is about how easily a few centuries can reshape our assumptions, and how slowly biology changes compared to culture. When we compare 200,000 years of foraging life to a few hundred years of industrial routine, we begin to see how recent our certainty really is. The human body was shaped across ice ages, migrations, and shifting climates. It learned to manage energy when the next opportunity to eat was uncertain. It learned to conserve when necessary and to utilize abundance when available. That learning is written into our physiology, not as a conscious memory, but as regulatory systems that maintain balance across change. Throughout this long evolutionary period, survival depended on cooperation and flexibility rather than precision. Early humans did not count calories or measure macronutrients. They responded to what the land offered. A successful hunt might provide enough food for a large shared meal. A period of scarcity might require patience and movement. Neither state defined the species as a whole. What defined it was the ability to move between states without collapse. That ability is still present. Modern research continues to show that the body regulates blood sugar, energy use, and appetite through dynamic processes that adjust to intake over time. These processes are not locked to a 3-part daily division. They are calibrated to sustain function across hours and days. When agriculture introduced more predictable food supply, it did not instantly change human biology. It changed the external environment. Over generations, habits formed around fields and harvests. Later, industrialization synchronized time with greater force. The factory whistle replaced sunrise as a cue for beginning the day. Lunch breaks were inserted into work shifts. Dinner marked return from labor. These changes were powerful, but they unfolded over a narrow slice of human existence. The body remained largely as it had been, capable of managing intervals and adapting to routine when routine appeared. In the modern era, abundance and constant access add another layer of complexity. Food can be obtained at nearly any hour. Yet even within this abundance, individuals vary in how they experience hunger and fullness. Some feel comfortable with 3 structured meals. Others prefer 2 larger meals or smaller portions spread throughout the day. Cultural patterns influence perception, but physiology still operates beneath them. The underlying capacity for adjustment persists because it was forged in a world that required it. There is an educational value in recognizing this continuity. It tempers extreme conclusions. It reminds us that no single modern pattern represents the entire history of our species. 3 meals a day are neither ancient law nor universal truth. They are an arrangement that developed under specific economic and social conditions. Understanding this can reduce confusion between habit and necessity. It can also reduce anxiety. The human organism is not fragile in the face of moderate variation. It evolved precisely to manage variation. This perspective also invites humility. Our present routines may feel stable and permanent, yet history shows that patterns can change rapidly when environments shift. Agriculture transformed mobility. Industrialization transformed time. Modern technology transformed access. Each shift felt definitive in its moment. Yet beneath these transformations, the biological core remained steady. That steadiness is part of what allowed Homo sapiens to endure. When we return once more to the original question, the answer is both simple and expansive. Humans lived 200,000 years without 3 meals a day, because they were never biologically required to have them. The species developed under conditions where intake timing fluctuated. Energy systems evolved to handle that fluctuation. Structured meals emerged later as tools for organizing labor and social life. They solved coordination problems, not evolutionary ones. Recognizing this does not prescribe how anyone should eat today. It does not romanticize the past or criticize the present. Instead, it clarifies scale. It shows that what feels permanent may be recent, and that what is recent rests upon a far older foundation. The body you inhabit today is the descendant of bodies that crossed deserts without lunch breaks, that endured winters without refrigerators, and that navigated landscapes where hunger rose and fell with the land itself. That inheritance is not a burden, it is a testament to adaptability. If our ancestors could live across such variability for nearly 200,000 years, what might that suggest about the quiet resilience still present within us now? As we come to the end of this long reflection, the question remains gently open rather than sharply answered. Why did humans live 200,000 years without 3 meals a day? By now, the response no longer feels like a surprise. They lived without them because they could. Because the landscapes that shaped them did not provide fixed hours. Because the body they carried was designed to manage intervals, not to depend on precision. Because survival favored flexibility over rigidity. Across deserts, forests, coastlines, and ice-bound plains, Homo sapiens endured without breakfast tables or lunch breaks. The species adapted not by enforcing strict timing, but by responding to change. That response became our inheritance. For most of our existence, hunger rose in relation to effort and opportunity. Food was found, shared, prepared, and consumed within a web of cooperation and environment. There were seasons of abundance and moments of scarcity, yet through it all, the body maintained balance across time. Glycogen stored energy for hours. Fat carried energy across days. Hormones signaled when reserves shifted. None of these systems required a clock. They required only enough nourishment over time to sustain life and reproduction. That sufficiency was enough for humanity to expand across continents and build the earliest forms of culture. Agriculture introduced new stability. Industry introduced new synchronization. Modern abundance introduced new constancy. Each stage changed how food is organized in daily life. 3 meals a day became common because they fit fields, factories, and family schedules. They provided structure in increasingly complex societies, but they arrived late in the story. They are part of the most recent chapter, not the foundation of the species. Beneath the kitchen light and the ticking clock remains a body shaped in far older rhythms. Recognizing this history offers something steady and educational. It reminds us that biology moves slowly compared to culture. It reminds us that the habits we call normal are often young in evolutionary terms. And it reminds us that adaptability is one of our deepest strengths. The human organism has navigated dramatic environmental shifts without losing its core design. That design includes the capacity to function without rigid meal timing, just as it includes the capacity to adapt when such timing becomes common. There is value in seeing our routines in their proper scale. It reduces unnecessary fear. It softens extreme claims about what is absolutely required. It encourages respect for the body's resilience without turning history into prescription. The goal is not to abandon modern patterns, nor to romanticize ancient hardship. It is simply to understand that our species endured for nearly 200,000 years in conditions very different from today, and that endurance was possible because the body was built for change. If hunger once followed the migration of animals and the ripening of plants, and if it now follows work schedules and school bells, what remains constant is not the timing of meals but the adaptability of the human organism. That adaptability is the quiet thread running through our entire history. It is what allowed us to survive without 3 meals a day, and it is what allows us to live within them now. So, as the day closes and the modern world settles into its familiar rhythms, perhaps the deeper question is no longer about how many times we eat, but about how much of our past still lives within us. If our ancestors could navigate uncertainty for nearly 200,000 years without the structure we now consider normal, what does that reveal about the enduring flexibility of the human body and mind?